such sights to show you.
I recently found myself binge-watching addiction movies, and I noticed the strangest thing. None of the movies were actually showing addiction. They attempted to show his face, but only managed to show people that were addicted to things like drugs, alcohol, or gambling. The focus was on the physical, emotional, and mental breakdown due to their substance or behavioral abuse, but addiction itself remained unseen. Addiction is a disorder that causes a person to compulsively pursue rewarding stimuli at the expense of everything else in their life. But simply combining a person and a pleasurable stimuli doesn't create addiction. Addiction exists independently, as an antagonist at war with sobriety. But what does this war look like inside the mind of a person battling an addiction? There's only one film that accurately shows the internal struggle of addiction and gives it a recognizable face. In my opinion, it's the most intense cinematic portrayal of addiction ever. That film is 1987's Hellraiser. Written and directed by Clive Barker, Hellraiser is a nearly identical adaptation of his novella The Hellbound Heart. From the very first scene, we're plunged right into the story just as Frank is buying the puzzle box and summoning the Cenobites. The puzzle box is the physical representation of a highly potent and addictive drug, and the Cenobites are the personification of addiction. As the lead Cenobite, Pinhead embodies the most destructive type of addiction. He has a cold indifference to everything but the pleasures that he can offer, and boldly mocks the things that might help addicts escape, such as religion and medical attention. Despite the warnings, Frank takes large quantities of his new drug and comes face to face with addiction. He ignores the dangers and takes more of the drug and finds himself literally hooked by that addiction. Frank manages to temporarily escape into sobriety, but as with any addiction, Pinhead says,
"Nobody escapes us."
This is where we first see Larry, although we've actually already met this character before. Larry and Frank are presented as brothers, but they're really two halves of the same person. The Larry side is a devoted husband and father, clean-cut, mild-mannered, and most important, sober. The Frank side is bold and selfish and lives a life of carefree hedonism, but isn't addicted. When Frank's addictive desires bleed over into Larry's weaknesses, the two personalities combine. They relapse into drug use and they become their true self. Larry's remained sober since the last time we saw him as Frank. He's gotten his life together and recently left rehab to live in his old family home. For years, Frank used his house to feed his desires, but Larry wants to forget about his past and start fresh with his new, sober life. Part of the process of starting fresh is mending his broken relationship with his distant daughter, Kirsty, who's been away from him because of his past addiction issues. His wife, Julia, finds some old photos and remembers when her husband was fun, exciting, and unpredictable, before he was addicted to drugs. She begins to yearn for that side of him to return and fantasizes about it constantly. As they're moving in and getting settled, Larry is overcome with the desire to get high. The memories of his past life overwhelm him, and the first stage of his relapse into addiction begins. Kirsty has experimented with drugs in the past, and much like her father, she has problems with addictive behavior. Her desire to get high is not turned into an addiction yet, but has been growing harder to ignore. She decides to confront her desire and is able to push it out of her mind, temporarily. When Julia discovers that Larry is using drugs again, she's horrified. He begs for her to help him get better, as she assumes the role of enabler. Enablers are very important in keeping an addiction alive. They take the guilt and responsibility away from the addict and allow them to avoid facing the consequences of their poor decision. Frank sends Julia out to get less powerful drugs than the box, so he can feel better while he's recovering. The pain of quitting cold turkey is too much for him to handle. Once he feels better, he tells Julia about his experience when using the box and why his addiction is so hard to defeat. He tells her the sensation is like nothing he's ever experienced, where
pain and pleasure, indivisible.
Julia grows more conflicted as she becomes seduced by addiction herself. She enjoys the comfort and stability of a sober Larry, but increasingly craves the excitement of his Frank side. Larry is starting to regain control again, but the Frank side is tired of being pushed into Larry's subconscious. As Frank goes stronger, a desire to use the box hits Larry hard, but Julia desperately wants to stop him from having to confront his internal struggles right now. It's at this point where Julia makes the decision to sabotage Larry so Frank can return. Kirsty discovers that her dad is using again when she catches Julia bringing him drugs. When she confronts him, he's barely recognizable in his intoxicated state. Frank tries to convince her that everything is okay, but she doesn't believe him. So she decides to steal his drugs and run away. Emotionally overwhelmed, Kirsty decides to use a small amount of the drugs she stole from her dad. But the box is too strong for her to handle, and she passes out in the streets. Kirsty wakes up in the hospital and is immediately intrigued by her first experience with the box. She tries a small amount again and enjoys the sensation, so she decides to have a full dose of the box. This is when she has her first encounter with true addiction. When Pinhead is asked what he is, he says,
Demons to some, angels to others.
This perfectly sums up the experience with an addiction. It begins as a euphoric escape into heaven, but turns into a hellish prison where
pain and pleasure, indivisible.
Kirsty manages to reclaim her sobriety and now has a better understanding of what her dad is going through. So she returns to the house to make one last attempt to save her father. She believes that he's back to his sober self, but has the feeling that something isn't right. She knows about his Frank personality and begs for him to stay sober and not allow Frank to return to destroy his life again.
He's trying to kill you! He's gonna kill you!
Julia tries to reassure Kirsty that Frank is gone and her dad is done with drugs, but she doesn't believe her. In a fit of frustration, Flary resorts to domestic violence and assaults Julia. When Kirsty sees what her dad has become, she understands that he will never be sober again. She tells him that she regrets giving him another chance, and this devastates him. His addiction finally overwhelms him, and Kirsty helplessly watches as her father overdoses. In that moment, her own addiction returns more aggressively than before. But having stronger willpower than her father, she's able to overcome her addiction. She tries to destroy the drug so no one else can be hurt by it, but addiction isn't limited to one person or one vice. If you've never seen the original Hellraiser or read The Hellbound Heart, now is the perfect time to experience them. For all those who have seen the film or read the book, I urge you to revisit them and see the story for what it really is. A father and daughter struggling to escape addiction, and the face of addiction is Pinhead and the Cenobites.
What's your pleasure, sir?
Pleasure. Pleasure. I can taste that pleasure. Pain and pleasure.